For those of you who don't know, ISAW, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, is a graduate school and research institute of NYU located in the Upper East Side by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. Archaeology is an essential part of ISAW's mission to understand the diverse civilizations of the ancient world and their interactions with one another. ISAW sponsors a robust program of archaeological fieldwork activity focusing on periods ranging from the 5th millennium BC to the early medieval period. This program has included faculty-led projects in Egypt, Turkey, Iraqi Kurdistan, Uzbekistan, China, and an upcoming project in Crete, which I believe Antonis will elaborate on later. I mentioned these things about archaeology because they are a huge factor in the presentation today, which will be really exciting, and I look forward to it. So to move on to our presenters, Lorenzo D'Alfonso is professor of ancient Western Asian archaeology and history at ISAW and associate professor of ancient Western Asian archaeology at the University of Pavia. He obtained his PhD in Aegean and Anatolian civilizations at Florence University and has worked for several years in Germany at the Free University in Berlin, at the J. Gutenberg University in Mainz, and then at the University of Constance. Between 2008 and 2010, he worked and taught at the University of Pavia before starting his career at ISAW in 2011. His research investigates the social and political history and archaeology of the Eastern Mediterranean, with a particular focus on 2nd and 1st millennium BCE Syria and Anatolia. He has produced 4 books, with a 5th in press, more than 80 papers between journal articles, contributions to volumes, and proceedings of international congresses. It's very busy. And since 2011, he is the director of the International Excavation Project at Nigdikinihoik in Cappadocia, Turkey. Antonis Kotsonas, our other presenter today, is associate professor of Mediterranean history and archaeology at ISAW. He holds a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, an MPhil from the University of Cambridge, and a BA from the University of Crete. His research focuses on the material culture of socioeconomic history of Greece and the Mediterranean in the 1st millennium BCE. He has produced numerous articles and 4 books as well, the latest of which received an award from Choice Magazine for Outstanding Academic Title. Professor Kotsonas has extensive experience in excavation and finds research, and this summer, as I mentioned earlier, he'll be starting a new excavation project at the ancient city of Lektos in Crete, in Greece. So thank you both for sharing this fascinating presentation with us today. I look forward to hearing it alongside our virtual audience, because this used to be a lecture and I didn't get to hear about, so it's fascinating to me as well. One quick housekeeping tip, if everyone can remember, again, to direct any questions to the Q&A feature. We'll make time for it after the presentation. So without any further ado, Lorenzo and Antonis.
Thank you very much, Iris, and thank to Michelle that will help us with this. So I will take the lead, Antonis, and we'll start our lecture today on wine and feasting in the ancient Mediterranean. And you see here, our topic, feasting, is not what you normally want to primarily approach when you think, oh, I want to explore an ancient civilization. One rather thinks to military deeds, political, technological achievements of a civilization, or, for example, monumental art that a civilization produced. In fact, all of them are very legitimate ways of approaching ancient societies. But if we are interested in really understanding what the individual identities of the people living at a given time were able to construct as a form of group identity, then there are specific contexts we want to look into, and feasting is, of course, one of them. Feasting can be defined as a ritual event in which communal consumption of food and drinks, selected ones, are taking place. As far as we are concerned, next, please, we will focus in particular on wine as one of these food and drinks typical of the Mediterranean banquets. And well, as in the past, as in our days, wine and banqueting can take different forms and represent different types of events. And you see here two completely different settings, both of them, however, tightly connected with wine drinking. And we can imagine that people sitting at the two different tables here, they will have different kind of conversation. They will be dressed in different ways. There will be different items discussed and maybe different sorts of people will take will take part to the banquet as well. So the same kind of reflection that these two table settings inspire us are what we will try to bring you into during our lecture today. Why do we focus on the Mediterranean? Well, the Mediterranean is one of the areas in which cultivation and production then of wine is possible. It is made possible because we are at the latitude between the 10 to 20 Celsius degrees isotherms, means temperature during the year. So this is the areas where today it is, viticulture is thriving. If we go back to the ancient world, however, so pay attention to the image to the bottom right. Next slide, please. To the bottom right of our picture, well, you can see here that we have an image where we see where in the ancient world vine grape was cultivated. So from the Western Mediterranean down to the southern part of the Caspian Sea, encompassing therefore the Mediterranean area and a big chunk of Southwest Asia. Next, please. How is this possible? Well, we should go a little bit in the history of the species and so on. There are several wild wine species, but only one, the Eurasian one, is the one that produced grapes and therefore that is useful to produce the wine. We can see that in the history of the earth, this different species of wild vine, but also of the one we're interested in, the Vitis vinifera, were widespread. But after the cooling of the Pleistocene, niches with these plants, with this species, only remain in the area that roughly stays between the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, Eastern Anatolia, Northern Iran today. And then there are two passages, one happening between the 5th and the 4th millennium, in which there is an expansion towards the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean, and then a second passage during the 1st millennium, in which the Vitis vinifera is then attested all over around the Mediterranean. In both cases, the spread is connected with human activity. Next, please. So if we stay in the core area of where the species was first preserved, it's not a surprise that the earliest archaeological traces of ancient wine come from this area. You see here Neolithic wine as it has been suggested after the residue analysis on sherds from two excavations belonging to the so-called Sulavari-Shumutepe culture in modern Georgia. And what you see in these residues is the presence of the typical chemical signature that we associate with wine, that is tartaric acid, and in this case above all, malic acids. In the next slide, instead, you can see one of the most spectacular early contexts for wine production and storage. This is the Areni cave in Armenia. We're talking about the 4th millennium BCE. It is the late Chalcolithic, the what we call the latest part of prehistory. And in the next slide, you can really see what's been found inside of the cave. So several layers with pressing area, pots, and storage jar in the floor for the conservation of the grape juice. So you can also see here some of the best, earliest preserved archaeobotanical remain associated with grapevines, sorry, and we have pips of the grapes, but we also have preserved really parts and bits and pieces of the plant, so leaves, small branches, and so on. One big difference, next slide please, that is present in Southwest Asia is the moment in which wine becomes a luxury good. When does it happen? This happens during the Bronze Age, when trade is able to bring wine away, far away from areas of cultivation and production into areas where grapevine is not present, typically the southern part of the alluvium. So if the northern part of Southwestern Asia, the mountainous part is an area of production, if we go into the plain, if we go into the Jazeera, into Iraq, we have very little production there, but we have palaces, very rich polities, are organized around palaces, and they attest, as for the Palace of Mari on the bottom right in this slide, and they have archaeologically present some storage area for the storage of wine, and above all, a very rich archive of documents documenting the trade of wine with different sorts of wine. So we start having expensive, good, different medium, bad wine, as the list that you see in this slide in cuneiform shows. We also see in which occasion wine is used. This is kingly connected, so it's connected with royal banquets, it is connected with sacred rituals in which the king has a role, it is connected with international diplomacy. For example, there is a shipment of wine from the king of Mari to King Hammurabi of Babylon, more to the south. This next slide, this word of the larger Mesopotamia with area of production and area of consumption where wine is a luxury good associated with the palaces, sort of ends with the end of the late Bronze Age. That is also called the end of the palatial society. We know this is a major turning point in the history of the Mediterranean. A series of causes bring to the end of this period, and so droughts, internal crises, movements of people, earthquake have been called in this case. Now, what Antonis and I today want to explore is how our world of Western Asia and the Mediterranean look like in the Iron Age, in the next phase after this major change, what continues, what changed in our banqueting and in feasting, particularly in relation with wine. Next slide, please. If we start from the northern Levant, well, we, for example, here see the adoption of a new table set for banqueting. And this is also, of course, valid for the drinking set. You see here some bell-shaped bowls, typical of the Mycenaean, so typical of the Aegean, that are adopted in this region. But we see also some more hybridized adoptions, so local shapes that adopts a Mycenaean, sub-Mycenaean painting decorations. What is very interesting here is that this region, the northern Levant on the eastern Mediterranean, they were in contact with the Mycenaeans, with the Aegean even before. But before they used this, the vases coming from this region as luxury good. So very few people, very few wealthy people would have them and would show them as exotica in their banquets. The situation here changes completely. This becomes widely used from the entire population, and it is not a movement of population. These are local products. It's just a change. People adopt these new shapes, these new decorated vessels for their everyday life in banquets and feasting. Next slide. Another similar change that we see in this period, and this goes from circa 1000 BC to 700 BC, is the production of new funerary stelae showing scenes of funerary banquets, also with wine drinking. What is interesting here, they have a long tradition in the region, but normally they were associated with royal or palatial context. Here, for the first time, we have non-palatial elites that built these monuments for a large family context. What is interesting also is that this stele for the first time see the participation not only of male elite, but also of female one, as in the Karaman Marash stele that you see on the left, in which a woman sits in front of her own soul and banquets with her own soul. So this idea also that the soul of the deceased has to remain with the figurative representation on the stele and not in the corpse is also expanding in this period. Next slide. What I'm trying to give you is an idea of fragmentation and several new things happening connected with banqueting and wine drinking. If we go to Anatolia, this is where I do field work. It's the site of Kınıkıyık, as Iris mentioned before. In that region, South Cappadocia, there are several representations of the storm god of the vineyard. This is the god, the regional god that during the early first millennium is represented in several stelae and reliefs all over the region. You see it's represented with a bunch of grape instead, the thunder or the maize that we would more normally connect to the iconography of the storm god. Together with that, our work at the excavation has emphasized the presence of a new drinking set that is established at about 900 BC, and this consists of a crater, of a mug or beaker, as you want to call it, and of a transport jar. All of them are signaled by the presence of silhouette wild goats motifs with concentric circles as filling motifs, as you see in the drawing below. Now, also in this case, we see a regional spread of them, and we also see that we do not have one centralized production at one side, but the chemical and petrographic analysis of the pottery showed us that we have an exchange between a number of centers. Next slide, please. A number of centers, particularly in the southern part of the plateau. Very few specimena have been found at each site. This is also indicative of the fact that it is not a widely spread set for wine drinking, but instead something more elitarian. So what we can try to suggest here is that in this region we have the definition of a new ritual of drinking and a new drinking set that is somewhat connected with the definition of a new regional elite. Next, please. The most famous context for the engineerist for the first millennium, however, is the Assyrian one. And it can be associated as an paramount example with the Northwestern Palace at Nimrud. You see here reconstruction and a picture. I must mention that this palace was destroyed by ISIS few years ago. I am not able to talk about this in this topic. It would take too much time. But if anyone is interested in this, please ask in the Q&A portion. So this palace was the first palace of a new capital for the new Assyrian Empire. Next slide, please. Its inauguration is associated with a party that was so incredible that it was registered, it was, if you want, narrated on a stele that was set just outside of the exit of the throne room of the palace in a niche. The text doesn't go into detail of how the banquet really went, but informs us on all the quantitative aspects associated to it. And we know that 70,000 people took part in it, that it was a 10-day long party, and we know the exact quantity of all different sort of foods and wines and other beverages that were provided for this party. Next slide. Inside of the throne room, we also see the representation of the king at the banquet, and this is very different. So let me show the representation first. We see the Assyrian king drinking wine from a shallow bowl set in front of his mouth on the fingertips of his right hand. This image is standard and is repeated on seals, on small objects, on frescoes during all of the Assyrian Empire and beyond. It is taken and reproduced during the Achaemenid Empire, so down to the 4th century. It has a life of 600 years, more or less. If we look at the shape of the vessels, that's also valid. They remain the same for a lot of time. You see here wonderful bowls from the Queen's tomb in Nimrud. This is a kind of wine drinking that really sees the person throwing the party as a patron, and we call it in the literature a diacritic drinking. So parties are thrown just to give a strong impression on participants on the might and wealth of the person throwing the party. Now, if we go to the next slide, we see the a very last representation of a banquet from the Assyrian context. This is an exception. As you see, seated on the throne is the wife of the king, the queen, one of the few representations, in fact, of the queen in Assyrian art. And King Assurbanipal is celebrating the triumph over Elam, over Tuman, king of Elam, whose head is hanging from a tree on the left of this image, and he is drinking wine, not seated on throne, but laying on a couch. So this image has been very relevant in the discussion of the wine drinking in the Mediterranean. And I think that I can leave the floor to you, Antonis, to take from here and start to talk on how this went in the Mediterranean.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Let's have the next slide, please, to get a sense of geography. So Lorenzo has been talking about the area on the northeast part of this map. I'll be moving us a bit to the coast of the Mediterranean, especially to the area of modern Lebanon. The dark blue part on the right-hand side on the map, Israel, Cyprus, the island just next to the eastern Mediterranean coast. Greece will be my focus, but I'll be taking us also further west in areas colonized by the Greeks in light green, and also by those people we call the Phoenicians, who were also seafarers of the ancient Mediterranean and transferred goods and ideas across it like the Greeks did. I'm going to center my contribution on the famous Greek style of feasting. Next, please. This style of feasting is called the symposium or symposium in Latin, and literally means drinking together. The symposium was a culture-oriented drinking occasion separated from the actual eating, which took place before the drinking. The symposium was exclusive to elite men, and any females attending were either entertainers or prostitutes. Although the symposium was originally aristocratic in nature, those participating in it identified themselves as peers and projected an image of egalitarianism. With the establishment and the spread of democracy from the late 6th century onwards, the symposium became accessible to larger parts of the free population of the different Greek cities. The Greeks held their symposia in the evening in rooms lined with couches where 1 or 2 persons could lie, as you see on this image. They mixed their wine with water in large vessels, like the one you see on the bottom left, and they considered that drinking unmixed wine, like we do today, was a barbaric custom. The ratio of wine and water varied according to local and to individual preference. The symposium involved music and dancing, drinking games, witty jokes, but also sophisticated conversations. Most famously, the philosopher Plato wrote a treatise called the Symposium, which places a discussion around the nature of love on the occasion of a feast. Lastly, the Greek symposium involved sexual intercourse. It's widely agreed that the symposium emerged in Greece at some point in the 8th or the 7th century. Scholars disagree on the precise dating, and they also hold different views on whether this is a Greek development or comes from the Eastern Mediterranean, and therefore relates to what my colleague was just describing to you. Next slide, please. The imagery of the symposium is first attested in Greece in the late 7th century on a mixing bowl called crater, which was produced in the city of Corinth. The vase shows a mythical symposium featuring the mythical hero Heracles, which you see on the right-hand side of the complete vase. He's reclined on a couch. The event celebrates a certain athletic victory of Heracles, which won him the hand of Princess Iole, and the princess is standing between 2 couches. You see her face is outlined. It's not dark like the face of the men. And she is standing next to her brother, while her father, the host, is on the left-hand side, also reclined on a couch. It's interesting to compare this vase painting to the Assurbanipal relief, next please, which my colleague discussed, since the 2 date from roughly the same period. Obviously, both images involve feasting by people of elevated status, including individuals reclined on couches. However, there are major differences between the 2 artworks. The Assyrian relief shows the royal couple feasting with a range of attendants being there to serve them. In the Greek case, the feasting group is comprised solely by adult male. Princess Iole is just there to help identify the story. She's not partaking into the feasting. The petty king, who is the host on the Greek case, is no match for the Assyrian ruler. Indeed, he cannot be easily distinguished from his peers and therefore does not hold the special position of the Assyrian king. Another difference between the two images regards the vessels used. Lorenzo showed you earlier those hemispherical bowls without a foot, without any handles, which the Assyrians were using. On the contrary, the Greeks preferred to use cups with a high foot and handles. And this is what you see on this vase painting. These cups proved very popular across the Mediterranean at the same time, both among Greek and non-Greek communities. And it is tempting to speculate whether the export of this vessel came along with the diffusion of the etiquette of the Greek symposium, more or less like the spread of tea drinking in more recent time was associated with the export of Chinese porcelain. Given the range of differences between the two images and also the peculiarity of the Assyrian relief, I think it's safe to conclude that the Greek symposium did not originate from Assyria. It is more challenging, next slide please, to evaluate the extent to which the Greek symposium depends on developments in the Eastern Mediterranean. Look, for example, at this passage from the Bible, in which Prophet Amos scorns people who who enjoy earthly pleasures, who dine on beds of ivory and couches, who have their meat consumption accompanied by the sound of music, drink their wine in bowls, anoint themselves with the finest oils, and go into revelry in the context of what he calls the Marziah. Now, the Marziah has often been identified with the Greek symposium, but there are many uncertainties about over the nature of the Marziah in Near Eastern sources, and indeed there are clear differences with the Greek symposium, which involve the participation of women at the Marziah. Next slide. Also relevant to my discussion are two metal bowls found in Cyprus, but probably manufactured on Phoenicia in modern-day Lebanon. These bowls show feasts involving reclined participants, foods and mixing bowls, music and dancing, and even sensual intercourse on some of the couches. The images on these bowls recall some of the iconography of the Greek symposium, which is rendered, however, in a different artistic style. These vessels, however, and also the text of Prophet Amos suggest that certain aspects of the Greek symposium may be adapted to the East. And this is particularly so for the couches used in the Greek symposium and the habit of drinking in a reclined position. The possibility of Near Eastern input on the Greek symposium begs the question on the extent to which the symposium goes back to Greek prehistory or is a new phenomenon. I think it's highly unlikely that the symposium can be traced back to Greek prehistory, and I will explain why. Feasting and wine consumption was not uncommon in prehistoric Greece, but it did not follow the etiquette of the symposium. Next slide, please. For example, at the Mycenaean palace of Pylos, on the southern end of the Greek mainland, we have ample evidence from feasting, which ranges from textual descriptions of goods involved to wall paintings like the ones you see on the right-hand side, to actual vessels stacked on top of each other in what must have been the ancient cupboards where they were kept. The evidence taken together suggests that there were feasts involving the sacrifice of animals. In this case, you see a large bull on the top image, eating and drinking in cups and musical performances. Nonetheless, this combination of eating with drinking and also the seated position on the participants, as you see them in the lower wall painting, suggests that these practices were different than the etiquette of the symposium. The same difference is identifiable in the case of Homer's epics. Next slide, please. In this case, we have lengthy descriptions of the habit of dining. And as you see, we have some ritual action, like in the symposium. We have the singing of tales, not mentioned in this passage, but mentioned in other passages. But as you can read here, the heroes of Homer drink and eat at the same time, and also drink while seated, which is very different practice than what you get in the symposium. Clearly, the etiquette of the symposium is not established in Homer. This takes us back to the question when this etiquette was actually established. And next slide, please. The best evidence we have for this comes from a Greek colony in Italy, the small island of Ischia in the Bay of Naples. And this colony was called Pithecusae. And there we found a cup which was inscribed and was deposited in a burial. This is actually one of the earliest inscriptions in the Greek alphabet, and it's very important for our purposes. Why so? Because this cup alludes in the symposium in various ways. First, as you can read from the inscription reference to drinking from the cup. Also, it refers to Aphrodite, the goddess of love, which is a hint for sexual intercourse, which was essential for the Greek symposium. Additionally, the inscription is in verse. So what we have here is a short, jokey poem, which fits the witty and competitive spirit of the Greek symposium. And last but not least, the cup identifies itself as the cup of Nestor, who must be the mythical King Nestor described by Homer. And Homer tells us that this mythical king drank his wine from a large cup made of gold. Now, I think the Greeks at Pithecusae would have been amused to hold the cup, which identified itself as the cup of a king, although it was simply made of clay, while the cups of that king were known to be made of gold. The cup of Nestor, as we've named this vessel, establishes that by the late 8th century BCE, the Greeks had not only developed the symposium, but were also exporting it around the Mediterranean. And a few decades later, we see that the Etruscans had developed a comparative style of banqueting, which was very dominant in the area of the north of Italy, which the Etruscans occupied. The Etruscans, of course, introduced their own preferences in their style of banqueting, and these preferences would later surprise and even horrify some Greek authors. Back to Greece itself, the symposium was dominant across the area, but there was also regional variation. Next slide. Most notably, the city of Sparta, the famous rival of Athens, who was renowned for its warriors, developed a very different mode of feasting, which was embedded in their socio-political system. I'm particularly interested in this mode of feasting because my family originates from that part of the world. Anyway, next slide, please. As this text shows, in Sparta, there was no symposium, no drinking together, but the syssition, which means eating together. This very name suggests a different focus. And the warrior citizens of Sparta were divided, as you can see, in groups of 15, and they were asked to make a standard monthly contribution which paid for the common messes. The foodstuffs and drinks they consumed were restrained. Most famously, they consumed the black broth, which was made out of meat and blood. As this text shows, the messes involved men of all ages, including old men who were, allowed, however, a smaller portion of the food, no meat, but only the broth. Likewise, boys were involved because the Spartans thought that the syssitia were schools for sobriety, which were essential to the youth. The syssition was part of the education that made Spartan men immortalized by anything from ancient authors to Hollywood films. Slide, please. Most famously, the 300. The establishment of the Spartan syssition was attributed to the legendary Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus. Slide, please. And was intentionally designed to promote the spirit of austerity and solidarity that pervaded the Spartan culture. By establishing the syssitia, Lycurgus wanted to prevent the Spartans from taking, and I quote the text here, their meals at home, reclining on costly couches at costly tables, and ruining not only their characters, but also their bodies, but surrendering them to everyday desire. How did the Spartans end up with this very peculiar system? Slide, please. The ancient Greeks, including the philosopher Aristotle, agreed that the Spartan constitution was inspired from the island of Crete, and more specifically from the ancient city of Lictos, which was a Spartan colony. Ancient Greek literature preserved a long account of feasting at Lictos. Next slide, please. At Lictos, feasting took place at the Andrea, or men's club, which recalled the Spartan syssitia in several respects. First, in both cases, we had standard contribution by club members who were adult males. These contributions must have been stored in large storage vessels that, like the one you see on the slide, which are very commonly found at Lictos. At Lictos, as in Sparta, boys also attended their feast because they were considered to have educational value. Likewise, at both sides, age criteria govern the partition of food. Lastly, notice on the bottom lines of the text how sobriety was essential in Lictos, as in Sparta, as is also indicated by the prescriptions for the amount of wine to be consumed. I'm fascinated by this connection between Sparta and Lictos, and I plan to start excavation at the Cretan side as soon as the healthy situation allows it, hopefully in this summer. I believe we have identified, next slide please, a promising location at Lictos where we may be able to excavate one of these Andrea or men's club on the north foothills of the site. and therefore to understand local society and local modes of feasting. I think we may have there a public building of around 500 BCE, and I'm thinking so because, slide please, because of these finds of stone blocks with written inscriptions, which are indicative of the Cretan habit for inscribing laws on the walls of public buildings. These sort of suggestions give you an idea of how the teaching we do at NYU is research-led and is designed to offer our students the latest results of fieldwork. We hope that you, as alumni, will appreciate especially this connection between current research and the teaching of the new generation. And just to give you a glimpse of what our course on wine and feasting look like, we included this last slide, please. Here you can see our guest instructor, Chef Maria Loi, whom you may know from TV or from her famous restaurant. The chef offers our course group an experiential perspective on ancient feasting by preparing a 7-course meal with flavors from ancient Greece, which was based on the official cookbook of the Athens Olympics for 2004, which she produced. We are grateful to NYU's core curriculum program for making it possible for us to bring such a distinguished guest who has cooked for all kinds of people, including President Biden. And we, of course, are very thankful to to our provost, Professor Catherine Fleming, who you see on this slide, who for personally attending our course on that exciting day, which involved proper feasting, but I must say no wine. So thank you very much for your attention.
Wow, thank you so much. And I love the picture at the end. I hadn't seen that one from the class, so it's sort of very fun. And I didn't know that the chef had come was so well known. Thank you both, Lorenzo and Antonis, for something that made me sort of want to have a glass of wine while listening. We have a few questions coming in. I'm going to start with one from Naomi Miller, who asks a question: with Passover coming up, do you happen to know if the idea of that you should recline during the Seder it might come from the Greeks or the Assyrians? If you know, or either or at all.
Should I start and you go then, Antonis? I would say, first of all, very nice to hear from Naomi. Second, I would doubt that this is something that is directly connected with the political identity connected with banqueting and feasting in Assyria. So I think that most scholars in ancient Western Asian studies think that the representation of Assurbanipal is taken from the periphery into the core of the empire, as is often is the case for an imperial core. You look what is at the periphery and you make the best use of it. But since it is late and it is only one, it is difficult to think that it was really a core Assyrian thing. Other is what Antonis presented. Antonis.
Yeah, so I would add to this that as I was explaining, the Greeks spread the style of the symposium, but other people picked it up and did their own thing. In later times, the Romans established their own institution called the Convivium, which was different than the Greek one. And it's at in this institution, which was widespread when Christianity emerged. So it is a chain of local takes on the habit of eating and drinking reclined.
Thank you both. One more question from Victor Bonilla. Would you say something about the use of the Rhyton or horn-shaped drinking vessels across the Mediterranean and the Near East? Was it strictly for religious ceremonies and not feasting, or the both of them? Which one of you wants to tackle that one?
I can start, although the earlier finds are from the Near East. So we have right.
I couldn't hear very well the whole question, Iris. That was my problem. The first part of it, you were.
It was about the use of the Righten, the horn-shaped drinking vessel. If it was used specifically for religious ceremonies and not feasting, or both, across the Mediterranean and into the Near East.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a very broad question, and Raita are attested for millennia, and in most cases we see them associated with sacred contexts. There is particularly in the Anatolian context a direct link with judicial procedures. Of drinking the gods and drinking for Raita and so on. But I would leave to Antonis for the rest of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I would say in the core part of the Mediterranean, we use the term Raita to designate a variety of forms, not strictly horn-shaped vessels. The horn-shaped vessel definitely came to Greece and further west from the Near East. And you can see them have them in ritual context. You can also have them depicted in everyday sort of feasting. So you can have both.
Following the more academic questions, I have a fun question. And I don't know if you know the answer, either of you, Antonis, maybe, who invented Ouzo?
No, I do not have the answer to that, and never really wondered about this. It's certainly something post-dating, antiquity, and I'll have to look it up, I guess.
I have another question, which sort of is a comment and a question, and it's a little bit off of the subject matter, but I think actually, Lorenzo, at least you might have something interesting to add this. Jack B says this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and thanks to both, and was wondering if, in addition to students in their studying research, if you have any alumni colleges or alumni groups that support your excavations and digs, and where alumni can attend and assist with your explorations, and where he can read about both of your research.
So thank you very much.
Your excavations, so yeah.
Yeah. So I started first. Antonis is hopefully starting this summer, but there are several other excavations at ISO. I think that the only excavation that was really visited by an NYU alumni group was my excavation. I think it was back in 2014, and that was a very nice experience. We had a group of 36 people coming, staying the whole day with us, looking at the excavation with me, staying at the excavation house, and so on. Any support is, of course, welcome, and we offer lectures, and Iris in this would be much better than both of us in forwarding you to the rich program of lectures, conferences that we offer at ISO. We used to have an archaeology day, really to present our results every year. We couldn't have it this year, and I don't have to explain you why. But this is really something that Antonis and the other faculty doing archaeology really want to do, just to get in touch with our community and get a sense of the results that we are reaching. I don't know if you want to add anything, Antonis.
Yeah, I want to add one point you didn't cover. Research. You can read about our research on our ISO webpage, or you can also read on our Academia EDU website, where we upload a lot of what we publish. And of course, we'll be happy to respond to any questions. Specifically on that site, I'm planning to excavate. You can find a lecture I have given, and it's recorded online by the British School at Athens. If you type my name and the site of lictors, you'll get it. And yeah, and I'll be happy, like Lorenzo, I'm sure, to respond to any questions you have by email.
Thank you both for that. I think the last page will involve, we'll show some of our website links and social media if you want to follow us to find more about some of those things. I suppose we have time for maybe a couple more questions and we'll go back to the subject matter. With Geraldine, Jerry Fabricant's question, wondering about proof of drinking in the Bronze Age, if there was any, and what was that proof?
Can you repeat, who was drinking in the Bronze Age is the question?
Was there proof of drinking in the Bronze Age, and what does the proof look like? What does the proof come in the region?
Okay, if I understand correct, the question is about the archaeological and maybe epigraphic evidence for drinking, and this is extensive, wide, much more than what we could present. With Antonis, we really decided that we want to give you a sense of how Western Asia and the Mediterranean show us a diverse panorama on banqueting and feasting connected with wine. This is the takeaway we would like you to have going at the end of this meeting, but there are a rich number of sites. I only mentioned Tel Hariri, Mari, but if you think at Tel Kabri, also Middle Bronze Age, beginning of second millennium, where evidence are archaeological storage room jars with a lot of residue analysis done there. There is, if you go back to the fourth millennium, the whole starts with Godin Tepe in Iran. In Iran, there are also several evidence. Of course, there is a beer wine question that we didn't touch for lack of time, but of course, the more you go to the south, the more you stay in the plateau, the more beer is the alcoholic drinking. The more you go up in the hilly area in Anatolia and the South Caucasus, the more wine becomes prominent and the evidence with it. What is also important is, as I showed and mentioned for Mari, but the site of Rashtamra, Ugarit, the site of Hattusa, they all provide immense evidence for wine production epigraphically. And of course, there is a growing data set of archaeobotanical data on grapevine. Now, the first question was by Naomi Miller, which is worldwide famous for asking a question nobody asked. So when we find this evidence, is it always wine? Is it juice but not wine? Is it other forms like raisins of preservation of grapes? And the aim was making sweet, tasty the food, using grapes as a sweetener instead of an alcoholic beverage. This is also one amazing question.
I don't know if you want to add to that, Antonis, but I'll finish with one quick question, which I hope will have a positive answer. But Professor Sylvain Capel asks, how common in Greek antiquity was problematic drinking, and how it was dealt with if it was considered problematic. It sort of sounds like you were talking about sobriety and things like that. So those concepts did exist. So
it did exist. Although, of course, many of the symposia ended up in drunkenness and heavy intoxication. That was not considered a problem. Drinking alone was something they considered problematic. So it's a very different concept of the problem of over drinking than we have in the present world, but it was there. There was a concern. And it had to do with social concepts around it rather than health concerns.
I actually think that question got us over our timeline. We do have a lot of questions waiting for us. I'll send them along to Professors Antonis and Lorenzo after this, and they might be able to get to some of them over email. But if you look at your screen now, you'll see a lot of different ways of keeping in touch with all of us at ISAW, reading more about their research and upcoming lectures. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Antonis and Lorenzo, for giving this fascinating talk. And I hope everyone has a wonderful week.
Many thanks for the great question.
Thank you very much to you and to everyone.
Thank you.